May of 1886. In the back room of a small pharmacy in Atlanta, an extraordinary experiment was taking place. The owner of the experiment was pharmacist and Civil War veteran, Dr. John Pemberton. Due to the wounds he received in the war, Pemberton had become addicted to morphine. While trying to free himself from this addiction, he was also searching for a syrup formula that would help with headaches, fatigue, and digestive problems. This search laid the foundation for the discovery of one of the most iconic beverages in history. The mixture contained two remarkable ingredients. One was coca leaf extract, the raw material of cocaine, which at the time was legally used in limited amounts, and the other was cola nut, containing high levels of caffeine. Caramelized sugar was added to give flavor. A few secret plant extracts completed the formula. The brand's name also came from here, but the one who came up with the name was not Pemberton. It was his accountant, Frank Robinson. Robinson also designed the iconic curved Coca-Cola logo. After long efforts, the product was placed on shelves. On the first day, only 9 glasses were sold. But those 9 glasses were the beginning of a brand that would later reach billions of people and turn into a global empire. Unfortunately, Pemberton did not live long enough to see the rise of his formula. When he died in 1888, his shares passed into the hands of an ambitious businessman named Asa Candler. Candler repositioned Coca-Cola from a medicine to a refreshing beverage. Thanks to his aggressive marketing strategies, within a few decades, Coca-Cola became a well-known brand across America. 5 to 10 years later, a similar story would be written in another corner of America. In North Carolina, another pharmacist named Caleb Bradham had developed his own drink. In 1893, Bradham introduced this mixture to the market, and 5 years later it took the name Pepsi-Cola. Its name came from pepsin, one of the enzymes that help digestion. Bradham's dream was to create a giant brand like Coca-Cola. In the early 1900s, Pepsi gained a small but loyal customer base. However, during the World War, the sudden rise in sugar prices dealt the brand a heavy blow. In 1923, Pepsi went bankrupt. It was later revived by investors, but this time, fate knocked on its door during the years of the Great Depression, and the company once again came to the brink of crisis. By the 1930s, the difference between the two brands had become clear. Coca-Cola had almost become a national symbol. Pepsi, on the other hand, appeared as a small brand struggling to survive. But history had an interesting plan. Time would direct them to the same route, the same arena, the throne of the American beverage market. As the world was preparing for major wars, the story of Coca-Cola and Pepsi began to intersect not only on market shelves, but also on the stage of international politics. And this intersection would turn into a brand war under the shadow of the Cold War. When World War began, Coca-Cola was no longer an ordinary drink. It had become a symbol of the American way of life, the bottled version of freedom and the American dream. In 1941, when America entered the war, the company's CEO, Robert Woodruff, made a historic decision. Every soldier wearing an American uniform would be able to drink Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever in the world he was. Was this merely a commercial move? Think about it. A soldier risking his life at the front receives an ice-cold cola. In that moment, Coca-Cola was not just a drink, but a piece of home, a source of morale. That is why Coca-Cola established bottling facilities in 64 countries during the war. Thus, the brand began to take root not only alongside the American Army, but all around the world. Meanwhile, what was Pepsi doing? This is where things get interesting. Often remaining in Coca-Cola's shadow in the American market, Pepsi chose a different path in the post-war era. The brand aimed to create a younger and more innovative image, but the real breaking point would come in 1959. During the tensest days of the Cold War, at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, Pepsi CEO Donald Kendall made a historic move. He offered Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev a glass of Pepsi in front of cameras. Imagine this, a symbol of American capitalism in the hands of the most powerful man behind the Iron Curtain. This scene sent such a strong message that Pepsi became the first American brand sold in the Soviet Union. One could even call it a diplomatic victory. While Coca-Cola carried the flag of freedom in the West, Pepsi opened a new front in the East. Now this war was not only fought with gunfire on battlefield, but also with cola glasses on tables. The two brands carried states' power displays onto the stage with their logos. But competition would no longer be limited to leaders holding bottles. By the 1970s, the cola war moved onto television screens, and one of the fiercest advertising battles in history began. The 1970s were the golden age of television. Families gathered in front of the screen after dinner. Colorful commercials became an indispensable part of homes. At that moment, soft drinks began entering not only market shelves but also living rooms, sports arenas, and the heart of pop culture. Coca-Cola and Pepsi were no longer just beverages, they were selling lifestyles. So how did this lifestyle war begin? The answer is 1975. Pepsi launched the historic Pepsi Challenge campaign. In blind taste tests on the streets, people drank Coca-Cola and Pepsi without knowing which was which, and most chose Pepsi. Coca-Cola responded by maintaining its classic, reliable, family-friendly image. While Pepsi left the Maidan to youth, Coca-Cola was saying, "We are a family." Then came 1984. In 1984, Pepsi made one of the most striking advertising moves in history. Michael Jackson stepped onto the stage, and everything changed. That year, a record $5 million deal was signed with the King of Pop. Commercials featuring Michael Jackson dancing to Pepsi songs turned Pepsi into a trend among younger generations. Pepsi targeted a younger audience, and with its sweeter formula, especially in blind taste tests, it outperformed Coca-Cola. Because Pepsi had a higher sugar content, it left a more pleasing taste on the palate at first sip. This psychological advantage disturbed Coca-Cola, and in 1985, the historic decision came. New Coke. The company said, "If Pepsi is sweeter, we will change our formula." But they failed to consider one thing. The brand was intertwined not only with taste, but also with memories and habits. The result? A complete fiasco. Loyal consumers surrounded the company with protests, letters, and campaigns, demanding the return of the old formula. The anger of Coca-Cola lovers grew so much that New Coke survived only 79 days. Then the original recipe returned, this time with a different label, Coca-Cola Classic. Of course, these advertising wars were only the visible part of the iceberg. From the 1980s onward, the real competition moved to the global financial stage. Now the issue was no longer advertising, but massive capital power. By the 1980s, Coca-Cola and Pepsi were the two most recognized brands in the world. But this also strengthened the perception that they were independent and fully rival companies. Behind the scenes, however, a silent process was taking place. Major investment funds were slowly but steadily accumulating shares in these companies. Rising Wall Street stars like Vanguard Group and Fidelity Investments began taking strategic positions in Coca-Cola and Pepsi stocks. Founded in 1988, BlackRock was still a small player, but in the following years it would become one of the largest institutional investors in both brands. These funds did not directly manage daily operations, but they gathered enough shares to have influence on boards of directors. Thus, competition between Coca-Cola and Pepsi shifted from a winner-loser battle to a controlled game where the growth of both brands generated profit for shareholders. Interestingly, by the late 1980s, some of the top 10 institutional shareholders of Coca-Cola and Pepsi had become the same. In other words, at the shareholder level, the war between the two brands had turned into a competition that was profitable in every outcome. With the 2000s, these financial giants were no longer only backstage. They strengthened control over supply chains and raw material agreements. Although competition continued, both brands were now in the same boat. By the 2000s, Coca-Cola and Pepsi had spread to every corner of the global market. In commercials, they still sent harsh messages to each other, challenging one another with slogans like best-selling or the choice of the younger generation. But financial reports and supply chain data revealed a very different picture in the background. Both brands benefited from the same major manufacturers, the same packaging suppliers, and even the same logistics networks. Agreements with giants like Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland for corn syrup supply lowered costs while limiting the harshness of competition. Moreover, these agreements were often made at the same prices and conditions. On the shareholder side, the picture was even more striking. By 2008, three of Coca-Cola's five largest shareholders were also among Pepsi's largest shareholders. This became an invisible thread binding the fate of both companies in the stock market. While consumers debated Coca-Cola or Pepsi, behind the scenes the growth of both brands filled the pockets of the same investors. This was essentially a classic market-sharing strategy, and in the 2000s it would reach a whole new dimension. Now the issue was not only sharing the same resources, but also silently dividing the world's regions. By the 2010s, Coca-Cola and Pepsi had become two giant empires operating in more than 200 countries. But when you look carefully at the global map, you notice that competition was not equally intense everywhere. In some regions, Coca-Cola was almost the sole dominant power, while in others, Pepsi stood out. India was one of the most striking examples. Entering the market together in the 1990s, by the 2010s the two brands seemed to have practically shared regions of the market. Coca-Cola was stronger in northern states and rural areas, while Pepsi ran aggressive campaigns in big cities with dense young populations. In China, the situation was different. Coca-Cola carried its flag in major cities and tourist areas, while Pepsi positioned itself in second and third-tier cities through local partnerships. This apparent differentiation softened competition and kept both brands' market shares stable. In Africa, Coca-Cola had almost absolute dominance. Pepsi showed serious presence only in Nigeria and a few North African countries. Thus, Africa became Coca-Cola's backyard, while Pepsi directed its resources to other continents. Some experts interpreted this as a silent agreement. Of course, there was no official document or open declaration of market division, but overlapping sales data and marketing strategies suggested that the two giants now preferred sharing the world rather than consuming each other. Yet in the consumer's mind, a strong sense of competition still continued. Because perception management was the most critical front of this battle, a chessboard played with emotions. For decades, Coca-Cola and Pepsi crafted their marketing language so masterfully that consumers began to feel like members of two opposing fan groups. This deliberate strategy kept the perception of rivalry alive and ensured the brands stayed constantly in the spotlight. Coca-Cola built its brand identity on emotions, family bonds, friendship, holiday tables, and moments of happiness. Pepsi took the opposite path, embracing youth, dynamism, and innovation. From Michael Jackson to Beyoncé, from Britney Spears to football stars, icons of pop culture became the faces of Pepsi ads. Slogans like "Live in the Moment" and "The Choice of the New Generation" kept the brand young and energetic. This separation created clear polarization among consumers. In reality, both brands ruled different emotional territories of the market, growing the total consumer pie together. And the truth behind it was this: the fiercer the rivalry appeared, the more sales increased. Behind the scenes, it became a game where both sides won. So what happens next? In a world where sugar-free drinks are rising and energy drinks are rapidly growing, will these two giant empires continue as true rivals, or will they deepen their invisible partnerships even further? By the 2000s, Coca-Cola and Pepsi were still two of the strongest brands in the world, but the beverage world was no longer limited to carbonated colas. Consumer preferences were changing rapidly. Sugar-free and low-calorie drinks, energy drinks, coffee-based products, and health-focused beverages were growing steadily. In this transformation, both brands made similar moves. Coca-Cola entered the coffee market by acquiring Costa Coffee alongside sugar-free variants like Coca-Cola Zero. Pepsi strengthened its position in energy drinks with Rockstar Energy and in healthy beverage categories with Tropicana and Naked Juice. Thus, competition expanded far beyond the cola bottle. On the financial side, the picture was even more remarkable. As of 2023, the top three shareholders of both Coca-Cola and Pepsi were the same: Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. These massive investment funds hold shares in many of the world's largest companies. So while the rivalry appears to continue on the surface, the real winners are the same global financial giants. No matter what, on the consumer side, the perception remains the same. Coca-Cola or Pepsi? This question will continue to be asked. Yet behind the scenes, perhaps every sip continues to flow into the pockets of the same investors. If you enjoy my videos, please support me by subscribing and sharing your valuable comments with me. Thank you.